Hi everyone, I'm Doug Osborne, a water resource engineer with SLR Consulting.
And I'm Jessica Louisos, water resource engineer with SLR Consulting, and we really like the construction aspect of our projects, maybe me more than Doug, but it's really neat to see something that we've worked on and designed and permitted actually get built on the ground. So we're hoping to share some of our experiences with many projects, some of which had a bunch of hiccups along the way, and we're hoping that we can share what we learned from those.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to take a step back before you start construction, talk about some pre-construction activities. We've heard about field work, design, permitting. So at this point, you have your design, you have your permits in hand. The next step is to put together bid documents to put out a advertisement to request bids from contractors. Some of the key components that we want to make sure to include in our bid announcement is a narrative of the scope of work, specifications. Often we have detail sheets, not as often a typical formal spec package or manual, but we'll point to the VTrans standard specs as well. Construction schedule and work windows, constraints around that for contractors to know. Regulatory requirements, insurance requirements, compensation. Of course, the contractor wants to know how they'll get paid. And then, of course, bid submittal information, whether it's in person, electronic, when, where, and finally, selection criteria. Often we're looking for the low bids, but we also want to make sure the contractor is able to do the work and qualified and has the experience to do so. I'll also mention something came up at work at lunch about sometimes I guess it can be forgotten to post bid, like get the advertisement out there. So it's good to make sure it's on the Vermont bid registry, it's sent out to anyone who's been worked with before to just make sure it's spread as wide as possible. A key component there is the bid schedule. Typically we'll post the bid and then a couple weeks later have the pre-bid meeting, which we'll talk a little more about. After that, there will be a time period to accept questions, which we'll put together an addendum for to send out to all the contractors who came to the pre-bid meeting. And then after that addendum, we want to make sure that there's at least a couple weeks for the contractors to put their bids together. Sometimes we are rushing and want to get into the construction window, but if there's not enough time there, then you'll receive fewer bids and not have as many options going forward. And then finally the bid will be awarded, and typically construction will start. July 1st is a typical in-stream work window start. Sometimes we've had projects start before that with mobilization and out-of-water work. So depending on the schedule, it could start before that. And then construction end often October 1st or shortly after. Again, it's constrained typically by in-water work window. So that'll depend on regulatory requirements and such. We'll include a bid sheet for the contractors to fill out. Some of the administrative pieces at the top, including the contact information, importantly references. When we receive the bids, we want to talk to the references provided by the competitive bids, understand what work they've done, how it went, if they've done similar projects before and such. Another important one we have there is the fill dump site. Sometimes on projects we have a fill site already identified, sometimes we don't. Either way, the contractor can either use the one identified or propose another, but we want to make sure that we understand what their bid includes. And then construction schedule and a price for each of the bid items that we have listed here. So we typically lump sum some of the aspects of the project that go together: mobilization, site preparation, the actual dam removal itself in this case, the channel work, including all of the sediment removal and haul, and finally site restoration. And at the bottom there, we have a couple add alternates. We, as part of our design and our field work, we are calculating the volume of the dam that's to be removed, the sediment to be removed, and hopefully that ends up being about what is actually there and what is actually removed during the project. But we will typically include this add alternate so that if it's greater or less than 10% we often use, then there will be some adjustment to compensation for the contractor. I think you're taking over, right?
Oh, I'm taking over. Look at that. So this is an example of one of our pre-bid meetings. I think one of the biggest things here, we always have these as mandatory. I know that not all people putting out to bid do that, but really want to stress that it's very important for contractors to see the site, really understand the site, and not only just have a token person at this meeting, but during the bid review process, I'll actually go through and really make sure that the person who did the estimating really understands and was at the site. So when we're looking at our bid, Doug, we've got a little summary here that looks at the price, but I'd like to stress that that's not the only thing we're looking at. We think it's really important to make sure that when you're putting out the bid, you have the option to really look at experience, schedule, and other aspects of the project. And sometimes that's actually asked for as part of the bid documents, or sometimes that's part of kind of reference checking that happens after you have the bids come in. We have had some projects that for maybe there's a specialized item that we really want more detail on as part of the bid, where we get information submitted maybe on a water control plan as part of the bid, or sometimes we're just talking through that with the contractor after we get the bid results back. So on the next slide, we have some example language here. This isn't actually one of our bids, but someone else's, but I really liked this. This 1, 2, and 3 just detail out some of the other selection criteria that's going to be looked at in addition to price. And when we're looking at the bids, it's sometimes just us and maybe our client, or sometimes it's a bigger team of stakeholders and funders that are kind of weighing in and potentially grading bids as well. So, when we're looking, it's really our responsibility as engineers to make sure that whoever is going to be doing the project with the actual excavation and the moving of material and really understands the project and is really the best fit for the project. Meaning, do they have the right labor? Do they have the right equipment? Are they close enough and maybe in proximity to be able to respond if something comes up? And there have been cases where we have not recommended going with the low bidder because maybe something just doesn't feel like a good fit for the project itself. So that's really what we're doing as part of this evaluation process.
Yeah, so the one thing we also wanted to emphasize before we get into construction, and this can take place much earlier in construction or not, but often we want to have a monitoring plan in place. Sometimes it's required by the permits, but even if not, we like to have monitoring stations set up before construction. And sometimes this can kind of get pushed off and forgotten, and construction's starting and you have to rush out there and establish. We like to have a few, you can see the letters there of our photo monitoring locations. We'll take photos in each direction and record a GPS point of that location so that both during the project, after the project, the following years, we can repeat those same pictures and have those good comparisons of before, after, and going forward. So good to make sure that you do before any construction starts and changes the existing conditions. And this is just an example from a dam removal in Northfield, the Camp Weecowie Dam. The initial pre-construction photo, you can see the dam there, and then you can see post-construction, the site relatively bare in the background, and then 3 of our successive monitoring trips as well.
So a pre-construction meeting, this is often required by permits. This came up in the last session. And it's really on site to go through permit conditions, what's going on, what the schedule is, what the sequence is, and really identify all the project team's roles and who's doing what. And I think one of the things that I really stress at the pre-construction meeting is that communication is key to a really good project, and understanding who's communicating with who about what and when is really important here. As well as establishing anything that the contractor feels like they might be doing a little bit differently from the plans, to make sure that that's approved right up front. As we get into the project, we are, as engineers, really looking for submittals. And this is something that's pretty common in our trade, but the specific things that we're looking for might be different for these kinds of projects. Some of them, are listed here, just really understanding how they're going to move the water, how they're going to move the sediment, what that looks like as different phases go through. For structure projects, we want to be looking at shop drawings of the structures and specific materials. And then on the next slide, we have some of the really special materials for these river restoration type projects. Really making sure that these items are sourced early and approved early for a lot of different reasons. The native seed mix that we will often use might take a while to get to the site. And, if you wait until you want the contractor to actually apply it on the ground, and then they have to go through a submittal process, it can hold things up, and you wind up not getting your restoration done when you want to. A lot of times they'll come back and want to substitute like a cultivar of a tree, which may or may not be acceptable. Stream bed material, if you need to bring it. This is something Josh was talking about, or even logs, just getting the logs to the site. This was a contractor who had a really hard time figuring out how to transport logs, wound up having to do it up with his own trailer. And for us, making sure there's no invasives on some of these materials that are coming onto the site. So we sometimes wind up actually going to a location where something is and reviewing those materials before they make it onto the site to really make sure they're going to fit the project. So different levels of oversight. It'd be really great if we always got to do full-time resident engineering and be on site all the time. But with our grant funding, that's not typically the case. So a lot of times we're doing part-time. So we're on site a couple of times a week, really trying to time that for the key activities so that we're there when we really need to be making decisions, reviewing things before a contractor gets too far away. Sometimes money's limited, and we're stuck with more limited oversight where you're kind of sharing that with partners, and that requires really full-time communication on any of these levels, especially when your visits to the site are limited. So along with that communication, when we're on site, we're looking at what's going on, what phase are they in, talking with the site foreman about anything that's come up while we weren't there, talking through the next steps, where they're going to move to next. Are they going to be moving the water to a different channel so that we can make a good plan for that? And making sure we have the tools in place to be able to check slopes and things. Works really well to do those checks with the contractor, but if you get to the site and they're not there, it's good to make sure you're prepared. And really checking where the fill goes, because as has been covered, it's important where it's going to. And circling back just on that communication, we're doing typically daily texts and phone calls with contractors if we're not on site, and then observation reports, really documenting the big changes, as well as approval of invoice change orders, and being kind of that clearinghouse for communication. So then we have an example of one of our observation reports, and we found these to be really helpful. These are showing who was on the site, who you talked to, what's happened, are there things stockpiled, what's the equipment, what's the expected schedule, and what's going to be happening next, as well as documenting the things that were already completed. And I've got to say, we go back to these a lot to say, this is when this thing was completed. This is when I gave the approval for something. This is when I said, we're going to need a change order, but it's not approved yet. And, to be able to kind of circle back on like what that communication was. So I know it takes time and sometimes you're tired at the end of a day, but, actually having this level of communication is really important.
So then we're going to come back to some of our, construction sequencing and water control and erosion control plans. This is a typical construction sheet that we'll include in our plans. It'll show site access, staging locations, limit of work, as well as providing a possible construction sequence. Josh talked about this in an earlier talk, but when the permitter is reviewing the plans, and then especially at the pre-construction meeting, they really want to know what the contractor's plan is, how they're going to sequence the work, what their water control plan is, as well as sediment and erosion management. So we will provide a possible sequence and water control plan and such that we see as possible, but ultimately the contractor can choose to use that or choose to provide their own. And so, when you're moving into construction and you're making your observation visits, reviewing the water control is really crucial. We want to make sure that they're prepared for any weather, that they're sequencing, removing sediment, controlling the water, whether it needs to be moved around, make sure that there aren't major discharges from the site. And importantly, that last bullet, often the contractor will be trying to do work in the dry on one part of the site, maybe carving out the new pilot channel, and then there's a point where they have to switch water from one channel to another, and that's a really key time to be on site. Make sure that they're ready, make sure that there's erosion control in place, and so there's always going to be minor discharge when that happens, but we just want to make sure it's a controlled manner and not just getting out of hand. Here we have a nice drone image of a dam removal a few years ago, that Weakawi Dam in Northfield again. You can see how the flow is actually moving down the original channel. They kept it in the original channel as long as possible, doing work on either side of it. You can't quite see, it's in the shadows up here, but they had a temporary crossing at the upstream portion of the site. The dam is actually just down here, out of sight around the corner. So they were phasing that lowering of the dam in small increments, removing sediment, and keeping the water clean and running through the site, not coming into their active work area for as long as possible. I wanted to include a culvert example in here. This was a culvert replacement in Warren, Vermont on Lincoln Gap Road a few years ago. Here you can see they're laying their forms, preparing to pour the concrete for the footing, and they're using sandbags and plastic. It's hard to see, but on the upstream end, blocking the flow of water, and they actually have it's kind of buried here and then discharging on the downstream end a bypass culvert around the site, as well as then they were pumping water that would seep into their active work area while they were working to keep it as dry as possible. Here's an example of sediment control on a dam that was completed this year, Wainwright, down in Salisbury, Vermont. You can see the contractor installed a series of riprap filter berms just downstream of the dam, which worked really great because, as water would pour over the dam and be carrying some of the sediment from the upstream work area, it would then filter through the riprap, and they could periodically dig out these pools and prevent the sediment from just moving downstream. Invasive species handling. I think we never come to a site and don't find invasive species, typically, right? There's often Japanese knotweed, Phragmites, there's something that we have to deal with that's in the work area. And there's, we always include notes on our plans about how to handle it, how to dispose of it, how to not move it around, track it around the site, or as Jessica mentioned, even potentially bringing it into the site from another location. So cleaning equipment ahead of time, handling it with care, and not mixing it into other clean materials. And then we really find that if you sequence to either totally avoid it for a period of time or remove it first is the best way to go about it. In this example up here, this is again our Camp Weecowie Dam in Northfield. The site was essentially a knotweed forest when we started, and the contractor came in, stripped all of the knotweed and the soil associated with it, and brought that all off first to bring to the disposal site. So then as they got into the clean fill material, they could bring that to the disposal site and bury the knotweed. But with 5 feet of clean fill is typically what we specify. So just having that plan in place, knowing that the contractor has a plan to take care of the invasive species is really important. Site access and travel around the site, we'll indicate the locations of site access. But from there, moving around the site can be really difficult at times. Often, as you can see here, you're dealing with really soft soils that machines might not be able to travel on without improvements. So in this case, the contractor laid down wood mats. There's swamp mats. They could, lay other material in order to move around the site and create as little, erosion and discharge as possible. But this is something that really needs to be thought out, and every time you're on the site, it needs to be reviewed and checked to see how it is working. Along with that, the contractor will often have to cross the channel at various points, and it will have to put in some sort of temporary crossing. Typically, you're putting in smaller culverts. In this case, there were a twin culvert put in and some truck mats placed over top just to temporarily be able to move across the river with as little disturbance as possible.
And I want to give credit to that one. Brandon Martin at Stone Environmental and Colby Hopp did this one this summer, and I forgot to put it on the slide, so I just wanted to say it out loud.
Yeah. I also just wanted to include this shot. This was Indian Rapids Dam in Plattsburgh last summer on the Saranac River. It was kind of a unique one where the contractor was able to just actually use the dam to move out across. It was a spot where there wasn't a lot of impounded sediment, so we didn't have to access upstream of the dam. And they basically lowered the dam to about halfway as they went to create a nice, basically concrete road. You can see their haul truck is able to back up onto the dam, and then they're able to load it and move out. So this was a really nice sequence that they had. You can see they opened up, their water control included opening up a portion of the dam to allow water to pass through, so that they were largely working in the dry where they were removing the concrete from the dam.
So permit compliance, you heard about some, getting the permits in the first place, and this is a long list, and not all of these permits would be required for every single project, but I think they need to be evaluated. Like Act 250, it's a big deal, and it's not necessarily triggered by our project, but if the project is on a site that already has an Act 250 permit, then you need one. Or V-Trans right away, if you don't always need one unless there's a state highway. So, I think from our perspective, it's our job to really understand what goes into these permits, what the requirements are, and what that looks like on the ground, to be able to anticipate ahead of time what we're supposed to be advising the contractors, and then when you're on site, being able to evaluate if it's being followed. So a model that I personally really like is to actually have some of the design team who did the design and did the permits actually on the site during construction, to be able to have like a direct line of communication kind of throughout the project. And I know with construction projects that's not always the case. There are specialized people who do construction oversight, but I just wanted to make a plug for that that model, which I as a designer, really like to see the project done as well, but I think that there's a real kind of compliance oversight benefit to having that be the case. So with that, I think it goes into, what are the things that we as people doing oversight really need to be looking for on a site? And this is going to be, a lot of that setup stuff. So posting permits, making sure, at least for the erosion control permit, your contractor has co-permittee status, getting the site safe and in compliance, both with road safety, any kind of barriers you need around your archaeologically sensitive area or wetlands, whether that be, staying out, or in the case of the photo up here, there was matting put down to protect a wetland crossing that needed to be maintained, and also doing the same thing at the fill sites, because, with these permits, the fill sites are also permitted to the, basically the same level, so you can't just have that fill going any old place on these kinds of projects. So with our fill sites, so there's a lot of stuff that can come up at these sites. First off, this is one where we found this fill site and we got it approved, and it turned out it was winter, so we had a stipulation that we needed to do a wetland delineation in the spring. That came, and the wetland was bigger than we thought, so the fill site actually wound up being smaller than we thought, and we had to do some pivoting and figure out, where that additional fill could go, was it acceptable for the invasive species, and, what the management wound up being here. So at this site, the landowner, claimed that they were going to be able to push off, the contractor wasn't going to have to do anything up here, but it turned out that the landowner was just conveniently unavailable and slow. So, the contractor wound up having to bring his own equipment up to deal with the fill site as well. So that was something that wasn't really clear ahead of time, and I think we're going to be more diligent about really, figuring out what's happening at these sites if they aren't controlled by the contractor. Let's see, so emergency action planning, I think, is next. So we have had some situations where contractor really wasn't ready, despite our kind of pushing here. So, but we really always want to make sure we have emergency contacts. People are watching the weather, not just us, the contractor, making sure there's materials on site for stabilization if it's needed, and really buttoning up the site before any kind of storm event. And that might include things like pulling out river crossings before a flood. So there could be different things that a contractor might actually be pushing back on here because it might cost them time, but it might be a really important thing that we want to be helping them work through along the way. Because if they don't, sometimes there's catastrophic consequences. So this was a project, Roy told these contractors many, many times that they couldn't be leaving their excavators right next to the river, needed to drive them up to higher ground. And, unfortunately there was a big storm, and, there was some erosion next to them and they tipped in, and there was no catastrophe here, but it was kind of a big deal at the time, and something that really set the contractor back. So, having that relationship and making sure that people are understanding kind of the flashiness of a stream and what could happen after a rainstorm is really important. We've seen that firsthand. It's still me, I guess. So breaching the dam, this is one of those things that we need to be on site for as people doing oversight, and we need to not only be on site, we need to be letting people know ahead of time that this is going to be happening, because a lot of our regulators want that heads up so they can either also be there or they can anticipate calls that they might be getting about it happening. I think also making sure that this is controlled, incremental, having a good plan in place, especially if maybe it starts to crumble faster than expected, what's going to happen. We like to have the contractor have some extra stabilization materials on site during these times, or at least have maybe some extra pieces of concrete, that might be able to be used to bolster an area. This was actually right downstream of where John had just been breaking a hole in the dam, so sometimes these holes look messy, but it's just a nice notch there. And, you know, a lot of times we need to pivot. You can go to the next one. We need to pivot in the field. This is a project we did this summer with Ron and Becky, and we had such a great plan, an amazing profile in place, and the contractor got out there, and they were hammering away and hammering away. You can see them up there, and it turned out that they didn't get to the bottom of the dam, and there was still concrete, and they said, we can't go any deeper. The hammer is getting wet and won't go any deeper. So this is a spot where it's backwatered by this pool. We're standing down near the riffle that controls the pool, and the dam site was actually backwatered. So we had originally said we're going to take it down to bedrock, and that was the goal. It turns out the concrete went a little deeper than that, some amount deeper than that, and the contractor couldn't reach anymore. So we needed to, I think the next slide shows it. This is the spot where the dam used to be. There's a beautiful free-flowing river, and I think we could have just been like, oh, the river's back, but we needed to take that extra step and make sure that the profile was going to work with the concrete, the level it was. So we worked with a contractor, did some field survey, marked up our plans, both the cross-section, you can see the cross-section of dam with the red line of where the concrete wound up in section and profile. Really went back and thought about that vertical range of adjustment, like how much is that river potentially going to change downstream? Maybe that bar and that riffle was going to move, and if that bar and riffle did move, was that okay? So worked with our project partners and funders and both regulators and non-regulatory people, the fish biologists that maybe don't need to sign the permit, but really needed some buy-in to make sure that the AOP goals were going to be met for the species. And the answer was yes, but it was a nice kind of check that we needed to go through to make sure everyone was on board with that field change. We also had a similar kind of a situation come up at a different dam removal this summer. You can see in the lower photo, this is actually the pilot channel on the, I guess it's the right, where bedrock was uncovered. The channel is still kind of up going around the excavation area with an isolation berm. You can see there's some bedrock veins, and we didn't know how deep those bedrock veins were exactly. So we had them excavate this out and survey it. And then we plotted that bedrock vein elevation on our profile and found it was half a foot higher than we expected in our design, which is like perfect. And had to think through if we wanted to change any of the design cross sections moving upstream, and ultimately didn't, but it was a nice check.
All right. So one of the pieces that can sometimes be a little tricky when you're not on site full time is quantifying the material that's being removed, the material that's being put in. And so you got to think about a couple of different ways that you can do it. One of the ways is when we have good detailed pre and post construction survey, we can compare and calculate volumes, how much sediment was removed, how much concrete was removed from the dam, if there's other materials that were removed, as well as how much, if there's slope stabilization or other infill as part of the project. Another way is requesting that the contractor is tracking how many trucks are leaving the site with how much material and what material, having those truck slips. Again, because if we're only on site 2 or 3 times a week, we're not there to count trucks and see how much material is in them. So there's a little bit of communication. There's certainly a little bit of trust there, but again, going back and having your own checks to confirm what you're being told. And another way to do that is going out and measuring the fill piles. Here, this was from a project in Rutland where the city wanted the material from the impoundment. It was nice, really rich soil that they were then going to use in the future. So the fill site had these big piles, and we went out and we measured the piles and measured the dimensions, the height, got a rough volume to compare to our design to see if what we said we were going to take out was what ended up coming to the fill sites. So then we move on to site restoration. One key thing early on, as just mentioned, is reviewing submittals of special materials. As she said, often we're specifying seed that requires time to process and acquire, that isn't just a conservation mix, isn't just a roadside mix, but we want those good wetland species and such that sometimes can have a long lead time. So we want to make sure the contractor has a source. We'll have that, often because of our work window, we're fighting the planting the growing season at the end of summer and fall. So we want to make sure that's getting down and having a chance to establish before winter. Another really important thing is phasing your stabilization during the project, both to comply with permits. The construction stormwater permit requires stabilization during the project and not leaving it open. So having the contractor consider, okay, if you're able to complete one section, can you seed and mulch it and totally, establish the site restoration during the project rather than, waiting until the end. Making sure that the planting and seeding and mulching is being done correctly. When you're planting trees, there's contractors aren't always, maybe they're excavating contractors or whatnot. They might not have that expertise. Maybe they contract it out, but if they're doing it themselves, making sure it's done to the details and the specs on the plans. And then finally, removing your construction access and restoring the site to existing or improved conditions, we always say on our plans. Often the project is mostly done, the river's restored, the dam's gone, and the contractor is ready to get out of there. But we want to make sure that the site is left, in good condition, that the landowners don't get upset that things were left in place, that the ruts were left in place on the access that weren't there before. So we really want to make sure that before equipment's off the site, that it's acceptable and ready to be demobilized from.
I'm going to jump in here. This is one we did this summer, and I think it's a really good example of a couple of the things Doug was just talking about. So the contractor has already completed the muddy, wet-looking side. It had just flooded, and I put this slide in here because it flooded like at night after they left the site for the day. But this was a site where we were really blessed to have some really great existing plant material. So as the contractor was kind of backing out of this soft area on the truck mats, they were kind of replanting native vegetation as they went. So the low, wet-looking side on the one side of the channel has been like replanted, and then it got flooded, and that replanted vegetation held the soil really well. We really did not have an erosion issue, even though it had just been excavated that very day. And then you see the contractor kind of working their way out on the other side of the channel. They had baled extra material across the river so that all that material was on the road side of the river. So as they were able to walk out, they were able to then bail that material behind them. But this was a spot where they needed to be completely done at a location before they got further away than they could reach, because there was no way to get back out there. It was way too wet, way too soft to soils. And so it required some kind of extra checking, making sure they had a really good system in place for them to be checking elevations when we weren't there, so that they weren't kind of getting too far ahead of themselves. This one did have some buckthorn and honeysuckle, so we had worked with the contractor to make sure they could, on their own, identify those invasive shrubs, and they were taking them off site, and they were replanting the dogwood and the things that we really wanted them to replant.
So, after site restoration, we want to make sure, similarly, before the contractor demobilizes, that we have a final site walk. This is a point where we'll include, the landowners, regulators, the town, anyone, interested and and involved in the project to come view the site while the contractor is still there, while we can still make adjustments, and create a punch list. Often they're working their way out, they're removing the construction access, but make sure that you don't want them to have their machinery gone and then have the landowners come out and say, oh, I thought you were going to do that too. Make sure that that's all done and the contractor isn't being held up. So, after construction, there's some project wrap-up to be completed. Often, different permits require as-built plans. The Army Corps office will typically require as-built plans if there were any changes during construction, or if there's still things to be completed. In this case, some of the plantings were being done the next spring, so we noted that those weren't done yet. They were going to happen in the future, as well as just what things were actually completed as designed. So here you can see there was this one add-on of some stone that was actually from the dam that was put in place to protect. This is actually a road embankment and a bridge just downstream of this dam that was removed. So that was an add-on during construction that was approved and then included in the red line as-built plans, as well as we went out and surveyed a cross-section through the dam to compare to the design that we had originally on the plans, because this was a spot with a lot of bedrock. It didn't end up being exactly as we had designed, nor does it ever really. And that goes alongside with closing out the permits. There's typically some notification that the project's over. Here's the as-built plans. It's been completed as designed to finalize the permitting process, as well as some photo documentation, as we talked about with our pre-construction, taking your monitoring photos. It's nice to get them right after construction, see the site stabilize, so that next year when you come back, you can compare it to those photos immediately after construction. And with that post-construction monitoring, it really varies from project to project, depending on what's required by the regulators. Sometimes there is no post-construction monitoring required, but a lot of the times they'll require that we submit some sort of proposed monitoring plan. That can include, as we've said, photos, cross sections that were taken before, after, and ongoing to see how the river is changing, how the site is changing over time. Pebble counts, so we can plot and see. In this case, we have a couple of cross sections where we were doing pebble counts. You can see the first year just after construction, the gradation curve shows that it's much finer, and then the next year we come back and it's coarsening as you expect. Fines are moving through the system, it's naturalizing. You're seeing that coarser natural bed material establishing. And then additionally, GPSing key features, if there's bank erosion, quantifying that, marking it, being able to go back and view it again. And sometimes water quality. I don't know if Jess, you want to talk about Wainwright. This isn't one that's typically done, but was required on a project this year.
Yes, and I hope that it's very rare, I'd say. It's the first one that we've seen that had this specific one. It is an impaired waterway, and there was a lot of questions about it. There's a lot of water quality monitoring that's been done over time, so I think they're interested in kind of seeing how that historic monitoring might change with the dam removal. So I think there's some just general interest in that particular project, but like Doug said, not a typical requirement. And then speaking of that project, I think this is what that looks like. This was done, I showed the picture a few slides ago where they were on the construction mats and it had just flooded. This is the site just about a month after construction. Not a ton of grass coming up yet, but you can still see the mulch and you can see a lot of habitat elements. And I wanted to show this one because it is, there were some extra coordination tasks with this one. You can see there's kind of those lines of wood across the channel, those are beaver dam analogs and post-assisted log structures, and the big pine that's been brought down. Those are all habitat elements that were done by a separate contractor, one that specializes in wood, the Nature Conservancy, and it definitely required some extra coordination because the idea was to get some of those wood structures in as the contractor kind of progressed up through the project so that it was phased. So those were done kind of along the way. And that coordination was a little difficult just because the contractor changed kind of where they were working a few times based on kind of weather conditions and, how wet the soils were. So sometimes those kinds of things fall to us to be kind of coordinating and making sure all the different players are on board and working together.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, I think that with that, any questions or comments?
Yeah, let me know if you have questions. I want to bring you the mic.
Yeah.
Anyone?
I have two quick comments and one question. First of all, on your oversight shared by partners, I saw you had those different levels, and the last one was oversight shared by partners. I found that to be a real problem, actually. Had issues with it when I was in the consulting world. Now that I'm in the NGO world again, I can do something about it. I think it shifts liability. I think the design engineers who do the design should be doing the oversight. I think there's a lot more to oversight than just standing there and being the warm body. So that when all of a sudden you have an NGO partner just standing out there and saying that they're providing oversight, again, you're disconnecting that liability of the design and making sure the design is constructed as planned. So I think it's a misunderstanding of what construction oversight is. So I would suggest strongly against that, and I would suggest strongly telling NGOs that it's not a good idea and that they likely do not have the right type of insurance for that. The next thing is on your bidding schedule. I noticed you had, putting it out in May and giving them a good amount of time, which I really appreciate, and then going to construction in July. I was told by one contractor once, after he had massively made a lot of money off of us because I just think a lot of things were done wrong. And I went to him afterwards and I said, how come you made so much money off of us? I mean, what was done wrong? And one of the big things he said is don't put something out to bid during our busy season when we already have a full plate. So if at all possible, and if all the partners can get their acts together on time, it's much better to put it out to bid in the winter, even if you're still going for July construction. And then the last thing was on your invasive species management. Have you ever had any true success cases? I mean, there are so many seeds from invasive species throughout the entire watershed and the river that sometimes I feel like these excessive invasive species managements on one tiny little site in this much larger watershed that has an issue is just like a practice in futility. And so I'm curious if you've ever had any real long-term success.
Yeah, well, this one's actually an interesting one here because the Phragmites was one patch near the power lines. And we actually feel pretty good about this one because it was one patch. It's not upstream, it's not downstream. We think it was like contamination off the road, so we're excited about this. Wea Cowie, which we showed a couple of photos of, and kind of that separation and stripping off the top. We were removing enough sediment there that we got below the root level, and we've done now 4 years of monitoring at the site, and there's a few tiny sprigs. It has not come back. It's been pretty amazing, and it is in the watershed, and it might come back, especially now we've had some big floods, but it's been pretty amazing to see the revegetation that's happened there. And I think for your two comments, I very much appreciate both of them. And it's true, when I got to that limited, I should have specifically said not recommended, because I agree, it's really, really hard when other people are also talking to contractor and giving them different direction. And I think that it's really hard for everyone involved. So with our cost estimates, we try to put like the part-time oversight cost in from the very beginning at concept design, so people know that that's part of the project.
And it's not like the clients can't be out there. It's just it's a different role.
Yeah. We try to establish the communication and who's making the decision and who's directing the contractor, you know. There. Sorry, I took the extra mic.
I was wondering, when you do see sediment runoff starting to get out of control, or if you do see the invasive species being not managed up to the level you designed, how easy is it to address that to the contractor? Are they pushing back a lot? Can you undo things that have been done? How do you go about that process, and has it been successful?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. You know, most of the contractors we worked with are great and responsive, and want to do a good job. And if we have input that something needs to change, they're responsive to that. There have been the cases where that's not true, and ultimately, there's permitters, there's regulators that could come down on them. We're out there and we're saying, water control has to be like this. This is the plan. But if they do something else and there's an uncontrolled release, then there could be warnings, there could be fines levied by regulators. So it's sort of that dance of working with the contractor, trying to get the design done right, and sometimes there are those competing motives of they want to move quickly and whatnot, but
And just keeping the relationship too.
yeah.
I'm going to get the regulator out here, and then still have to work with them for another.
Yeah, Monica, I think that's a really good one, the relationship. So I think we try to create a good working relationship with our contractors we're working with, and make it feel more like a partnership. I'm happy to have a discussion about this. How do you think it should be? I'm seeing some dirty water over here. Is there something, can we go look at it together and think about if we can change something? And I found that that's been really helpful. It's also been helpful that I'm getting older and they're getting younger, and that I must say that's actually been helpful. And it came up in the contractor session today that there's some generational knowledge and kind of maybe stubbornness. So what we're seeing is as contractors do more of these projects, they're understanding more about our goals and our reasoning, and the fact that these permits even exist in the first place. So I think the more we can talk about starting at the beginning in the pre-bid meeting, talking about this is an ecological restoration project. This is not about removing a little bit of concrete. It might say dam removal, but the dam is the dam's basically not even part of the project. On this one, the dam was so tiny compared to everything else we wanted them to do. So kind of establishing that expectation early.
Yeah, actually following up on that, I'm wondering if you could speak more to the experience of the contractors, just recognizing, or maybe, do you think that we need to build up the experience of contractors, that is there enough out there who've done enough of these projects that we feel comfortable, we've got it, or do we need to bring in new contractors who may not have the experience doing these kind of projects? And how does that affect kind of what you just talked about, sort of the construction oversight? I mean, you mentioned some of it, but I'm just curious if you have any more thoughts.
I mean, we have some amazing examples upstairs. I spent the whole rest of the day up with the contractors, and there's a lot there aren't a lot in the room, but the ones that are in the room, we've worked with most of them. And, for a few of them, it was, we kind of went a little bit out on a limb in some ways to hire them for their first dam removal project or culvert project, but kind of that bid selection process of being able to, talk to their references, talk to them, what kind of water control projects have they done in the past? Does it seem like they have a good enough understanding of the project to, maybe take that step from doing something like bridge or bank stabilization into, a project like this. And I think we've had, at least a few examples of people who are here today who we did that with, and now they're geared up and have maybe done more than one of these projects. And so I think, Will, you kind of hit it. Today is a really good example of why we're doing that, to give more education. Mm-hmm. And I guess the one other thing that I would say, and maybe this is a wrap up, is that a lot of the time that I'm on these construction sites, I feel like I have a teaching role. And, at this point, I've done a lot more of these projects than a lot of the contractors I'm working with. And, helping them understand, like, what might happen during a storm, kind of what the goals are, different things I've seen in the past on water and sediment management, and really the understanding of like why we're doing it, I think has been really helpful. And, to have those conversations with people, like standing out there in the river in the mud, is, I think, really helpful. And I don't know, it's a really enjoyable part of the job. Anything else, Doug? Or
one
I don't know where we're at with.
We're going to wrap up.
Who had another question? Back.
In the back there.
Oh.
Thanks. So I believe the Forest Service requires contractors to wash the undercarriages of equipment before they move on site. And I'm wondering if anybody can confirm that, and if other agencies are doing that. I've heard some contractors push back on that, saying it's not feasible or cost effective. So I'm just wondering if anybody's experienced with that, or if that has been an issue. Is it possible to build that into the budget to pay the contractor to do that before the equipment comes on site?
I know it's an expense. It's something we talked with the contractors about in the first session today, about like that extra expense of cleaning your equipment before you get onto the site, and then cleaning your equipment as you move around the site, maybe from an area with invasives and not. And, it takes time. And, it was kind of a bid tip, I guess you'd say. Like, it took, John 3 hours to power wash his machine to be able to go down and clean out the sediment trap. So I think it's something that we in this room need to recognize. If we're asking someone to take their machine from the invasive species area to go clean out the sediment trap, that's actually maybe a whole day of work. Like, that needs to happen before they contaminate the machine, and being able to kind of think through those different steps and understand like what we're asking. It's not always as easy as it seems. So, yeah.
All right.
Okay, I think we're getting the hook.
Yeah.